So, welcome everyone to the final day of the 2021 Sustainable Agriculture Summit. It is virtual this year, and we're seeing how that goes for the future. And we are so pleased here at the end to have Highline's own Shauna Freeman sharing with us some of her perspective about the big picture impacts of food, the sustainability of food and the food security and food chains and how they all come together to supply us with what we need. And so I won't ramble on any further, but I will simply say thank you for coming. And at the very end, there will be an opportunity to ask questions if there are any. So I'd like to hand it over to Shauna.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you so much. And I'm pleased to be joining the summit this year for the 2021 year because there's been a lot of change in terms of the sustainability of food and how that affects business. And it's all because of we're currently in COVID-19, our currently in a pandemic that hopefully will be over soon. But for the meantime, the things that I'll be able to share with you are still challenges that exist, oftentimes without a pandemic, but are certainly exacerbated by the fact that we are in a pandemic where there is more strain put on everyday life, and that's including our supply chain. So again, my name is Shauna Freeman. I'm a faculty member at Highline College, and I just want to take you through some of what I share with my students in terms of sustainability when it comes to food, and then again, the impacts that the changes we're seeing with COVID-19 have on our food security and the supply chain. So in today's session, we'll sort of focus on three main areas. And the first one is sort of thinking about what is business sustainability. If you're new to the idea of what do we see as sustainable from a big picture lens, we'll talk about that. Obviously, sustainability as it relates to food. And then we'll discuss a little more about supply chain specifically. What is it? And then how is it impacted by COVID-19? And then finally, we'll have a very short section where I'll provide a link to a video that you can watch later that's very interesting on what can we do if we're in these types of situations. You know, we see these big issues happening. What can we do as individuals? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So sustainability, what is it? From a very, direct terminology perspective, sustainability is focused on taking care of three things. So the environment, the economy, or what's, economical, and then community or people. And so when I teach sustainability in my business courses, we focus on sort of the three E's, the environment, the economy, and then equity, which again relates to people. And it's all in an effort to ensure that we're having enough of what we need for now, but also that we're leaving enough for future generations as well. And of course, that relates to food. If we think about, a lot of focus is sometimes put on sort of animal life preservation, right? And we don't think as much about food preservation, but if resources are depleted to a certain level, we may come to a day where we don't have certain foods that we have on the shelves right now in the future. And so those kinds of things are important. Those decisions need to be made now so that we prevent devastation for future generations. So then what is sustainable food? Again, it's thinking about, future generations, but it's also thinking about the now. So, our three E's, we're thinking about the health of the public, the people, what makes economical sense for farmers and producers and the people who make the food that we eat. And then, of course, the fair treatment of the earth and animals, the third E, environment. A sustainable food approach is really important, again, for those future generations, but it's also important. We look at sort of how it affects us on an individual level. We'll talk about how important that is in a moment when it comes to our personal health, the health of all of us as a society to have good, sustainable, healthy food. So you may be asking yourself, okay, well, how bad is it or how good is it? How sustainable is most of our food right now? And the short answer for that is not very. It's not overly sustainable in pretty much every area that we've sort of mentioned from a 3Es standpoint. And it's because of a lot of different things. Our population is growing very, very rapidly around the world, but obviously in certain regions as well. Water is becoming more and more scarce. We're looking at the impacts that climate change has had on the environment and how that affects our food supply. Of course, energy needs to be used in some ways. Part of that energy may be derived from very unsustainable means. So, like petroleum and things like that, that may ship our fruits and vegetables to the grocery store. Though that type of energy isn't sustainable, and so that's a problem as well. And of course, money is part of sort of everything. And so, who funds uh, how we make things more sustainable is an important piece. I tend to lean on the side of business is responsible for that versus, say, government and other entities. But that's sort of a conversation for another time. So when we think about food security, there are certain things we want to keep in mind how available it is. That's one area that lets us know, okay, is what's happening right now a sustainable food situation? Availability isn't always great. We think about if you've heard the term a food desert, this map here, it actually, this is sort of a map of where most of the food deserts are located in the US, and there's quite a number of them. A food desert is essentially where there's a lack of access to fresh and healthy food. So, that alone is part of the sort of unsustainability of our food situation. Availability, access, how the food's utilized, and then how stable the system overall is. As COVID-19 has shown us, it's not as stable as we thought it would be. And so going back to this idea of a food desert, okay, again, it's an area where there's a lack of fresh or healthy food. Living in a food desert may not seem like you think, desert, you may not live in a desert, a sort of a deserted area. At the same time, though, if you're not located typically within, say, a mile or so of a full size grocery store, that would be considered a food desert. If you're near maybe a convenience store or something like that, you have access to maybe milk or something like that, but typically not fresh fruits and vegetables and things like that, that are the preferred foods that we should be eating. So keep that in mind. And if you know that you live in a food desert, that's something to sort of consider in terms of what can you do about that. And so we'll talk about that sort of at the end. There's you shouldn't say, okay, well, all is lost. I live in a food desert. You may not have the ability to move. So what do you do? In most cases, there are things that you can do on a very individual level to mitigate some of the concerns that can come from not being very close to fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, that kind of thing. So those food system challenges that we've kind of started to talk about, they have a lot of effects. And obviously the health of the individual, of society as a whole is a problem. That's a big challenge. And that's why food insecurity in terms of having not having good access to good food is problematic. The ecological footprint in terms of how much again, going back to petroleum and those kind of things, how much of those resources are being utilized just to ship food to places where, if you're in a food desert, you're having to drive somewhere. You're likely having to drive or take some sort of public transit. You couldn't take a bike. That's problematic for our ecological footprint, in addition to whatever is being used for shipment. So there's a lot of issues there. And then, of course, from the very business side of things, where you're thinking about, okay, the agricultural competitiveness of all of it, in terms of what crops are being grown and how do you enhance your productivity? Does that potentially impact the health? Because now the farmers are being strained by so much pressure on the food system to produce more and more, that has reverberating effects as well. And in the end, food deserts, because it's more difficult sometimes to get food to those areas, you know, the one grocery store, let's say, that's within a 2 to 4 mile radius, the only one there, uh, the prices are often higher because we have these problems with access and inability to have food very, very closely accessible to the people who are going to use it. Versus where there's more competitive environment, the prices are typically lower. So in the end, it's much more positive to have a food system that's secure, where individuals aren't experiencing food insecurity, and of course, we have a more sustainable system overall. So this idea of food being a business, it is. That's the reality. You know, everything costs money, and our farmers, they put in a lot of money and expect, you know, a return for what they've grown. In every way, it's easy to say, I think, in most cases, that the higher quality and freshness of something is typically the higher price. And that doesn't always have to be that way. And we'll talk about some reasons why. But in most cases, you think of, you know, certain stores that profess to have organic something, or claim to have, you know, better quality, the prices are higher. Oftentimes that might be because you're located in a food desert, and that's the only grocery store or fresh food around. So kind of keep those things in mind when you're shopping at either a grocery store. We'll talk about other options as well that might be more preferred, and you'll notice that might have lower prices. So the supply chain overall, like, what does that look like if we're thinking about, okay, you know, I am someone who's really interested now in the food system, and you know, what does it look like from point A to point B? And you know, the obvious starting point would be you be the farm, right? Either agriculture or animal farm, whatever that might look like. And the next stage would typically be some form of um, manufacturing or processing, depending on, you know, what the product is. Goes through a packaging phase and then into transportation, some sort of distribution, where the food, the meat, whatever it is, it goes out to a market where typically you or I would buy it and take it home, right? So we're thinking very much sort of upstream would be everything that happens prior to sort of that distribution phase. And then downstream would be everything that's sort of at the sales point. So looking at potentially different types of marketplaces, and then home is all downstream. So that's what it looks like. Now, if we think about sort of all these different stages, you know, that means our food is taking a lot longer to get to us than, say, if I had grown it myself. We think about, you know, hundreds of years ago when we would, you know, prior to industrial revolution, everyone had their own sort of sustainable lifestyle. You had your little farm, and maybe you went to a blacksmith or something like that who specialized in something. But in most cases, you know, we all had a sustainable situation. That now is not the typical lifestyle. And because of that, our food is typically a lot older. It's gone through a lot more than what, you know, I think Mother Nature had intended for us when we're eating those foods. So it's just something to think about in terms of the supply chain sequence. It's very interesting. I think it's a very fascinating aspect of business. At the same time, though, from a food system standpoint, we maybe shouldn't want our food to go through such a lengthy process to get to our table. One thing that I think is important to mention is sort of the supply chain management aspect of it. It is a very meticulous part of business. And when you're dealing with food, there's a lot more requirements to keep things, for example, at certain temperatures, or to keep things from moving around too much. You don't want your food sort of bumped and dinged and all these kinds of things. At the same time, though, that type of coordination, the supply chain management, the intricacy of it, again, makes food more expensive. You know, there's a lot that goes into it. As fascinating as the coordination of it can be, it doesn't necessarily benefit you or I in the long run, other than saying, you don't have bruised fruits and vegetables. So all these things are going on in our food system, and it's, for the most part, humming along. Okay, there again, we've talked about some of the strains, the constraints on what's going on, but as soon as COVID-19 hit, it really shocked the world in a lot of ways. And the food and agriculture industry were really sort of thrown a loop for what was going on. And a big part of that had to do with there needed to be more restrictions on the handling of food, the interaction between workers who were handling the food. Of course, the changes in demand from consumers. So suddenly, folks weren't able to go out. So the food industry was really disrupted because restaurants were no longer a major buyer of upstream production. Closure of food production facilities. Again, we think back to those early days of COVID-19, where we were really seeing store shelves in a lot of ways, sort of, not just toilet paper, but in terms of our food, being really depleted because shipments weren't able to be made, or farmers were having to throw out old crops and things like that. We started to see more restriction on food trade policies in general, just because of um, a lot of over concern, and I shouldn't say over concern, a lot of concern in general about COVID-19 and not knowing what or how things might be transmitted in terms of the virus. And then, of course, all of the financial pressures that normally exist on the food supply chain were now sort of blown up because you pull one link out of the chain and suddenly it all sort of ripples apart. So COVID-19 truly shocked the food industry, which again has impacts in ways that we don't often talk about. It's like, oh man, I don't have whatever this ingredient is for me to cook with. The bigger issue, and one that is more concerning, especially in the long run, is what does that do to the health of individuals? Okay, we think about how important it is to have fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, fresh food in general. And yet there's two sort of sides of the spectrum. We have, certain areas where there's an excess of food, but then there are other areas where food is very insecure. There's food deserts, there's all these things. And so how do we bridge the gap? Because, if fruit and vegetable shelves were to continue to be depleted, what does that do to the health of people, society? We think about sustainability as being those three E's. People are a part of that. And society as a whole, if they don't have access to those healthy foods, it's very problematic, of course, in the long run. We think about the statistics that the CDC shares with us that 75% of healthcare is spent on chronic diseases, most of which are preventable. Individuals going hungry and safety concerns around food. Right now we think about, we hear outbreaks with things like romaine lettuce. All those kinds of things can continue to happen if there are these small little broken pieces of our supply chain that in the long run really hurt the health of our society. So it's important to sort of focus on how do we go about changing behavior, lifestyle, food choices. One of the easiest things to do is to, try to find ways to get access to healthy food for people. And so that's one of the primary solutions that COVID-19 has sort of brought about, is how do we find a way to ensure that communities have more access to healthy foods. So one way to safeguard is, if you live in an urban area, again, you're more likely to be in a food desert because you think about urban cities, there aren't a lot of grocery stores. It's much more commercial in terms of space. There may be housing and apartments and homes and things, but not typically fresh fruit and vegetables. Very sort of business oriented areas. But today we're seeing a lot more urban agriculture to specifically address concerns of food deserts and food insecurity. We've also seen a lot of policies be introduced to try to again, mitigate some of the issues that are going on with food insecurity, specifically in urban areas. And we now have a growing trend of people being more concerned or interested, at the very least, in working with restaurants or themselves having more of a farm to table perspective in terms of eliminating those middle stages of the supply chain, where you go directly from upstream, where you go straight from the farm to the kitchen table, or maybe even a restaurant table, and have your food prepared in that way. And that's an important aspect that can kind of eliminate some of those concerns with some of the other areas of the 3 E's. So I think a really interesting video to take a look on is a guerrilla gardener in South Central LA, presented as a TED Talk in 2013 by Ron Finley. It's a fascinating look at what an individual, someone who doesn't necessarily have a background in agriculture, someone who sees his work as also art, but understands the importance of what it does for the community to have access to fresh food, fresh fruit and vegetables. The very interesting thing about it is that it's something that started as his own project that now is a part of his community. So I'll share that video as a link with this video, with this presentation as well. So some things to think about, first, a great question to ask yourself is, well, do you have a garden at home? And it doesn't have to be some spacious area that you've sort of put raised bed gardens and all these kinds of things. I mean, I consider a home garden to be even your rosemary that you grow in your windowsill, right? That's a start, because now you're saving yourself the trip of going to the store. You replant and you grow it again. It's very sustainable, and it's somewhere to start to sort of see how you can go about growing for yourself, okay, before even thinking about anything community-wise. And so, of course, if you do have a home garden, again, that's kind of, maybe excluding flowers. If you do, that's a good start. But in terms of a food garden, that would be even better, right? And think about what are the types of things that you can grow, again, with limited space if necessary. If you have larger space, then you can really think about, okay, I'll maybe grow some tomatoes or some green beans. And the investment initially is very small in terms of what you get in return, especially if you're able to continue to grow and replant seeds. If you don't have a garden, okay, then think about, okay, would you be willing to start one when, right? Now we're starting to see some really good weather. It's currently right now spring. So, when would be a better time to actually start getting out there and trying to plant some time frame, season appropriate fruits and vegetables? Now might be a good way to do it. If you don't feel confident, then there are ways, and I'll share some of those ways that we can help you become more confident, to be sort of a mini expert in urban gardening. And then think of larger picture, okay? You may have your own ideas of what you want for your own garden, but would you be willing to start a community garden? If you check around, poke around, and one, if you live in a food desert, you may not even know it, but folks around you may be dying to have someone start a community garden. It's a project that may not necessarily have to be your own. It just takes finding a few folks who might be interested in joining in the endeavor. And these current times, in terms of COVID and folks being sort of stuck inside, that might be the one thing that can really get people engaged in coming back into the community. And if you are willing to start a community garden, then think about maybe selling that produce to a farmer's market. It's really powerful to go to a farmer's market and to see everyday people like you or I selling fruits and vegetables that they've grown themselves. It carries a sense of pride, and I think the community pride that comes with it almost always yields results in terms of profits, and so that's always a good thing too. In terms of how you might be able to become an expert in urban agriculture, Highline has a sustainable ag program, one that is really renowned through our community and has done some tremendous work in terms of connecting our Highline community to the communities around us, specifically for urban agriculture and addressing food desert issues. So if you're interested, certainly feel free to go to the website, even just if you're kind of curious about how to get involved. If you're not able to take a course right away, maybe just to lend a helping hand, that's always welcome as well. So in conclusion, COVID-19, it really disrupted what was already a stressed food system. It's important to consider that, we can do things at an individual level to help protect the system. And it has benefits for you individually, but obviously it can have major benefits for our community. And then know if you're in a food desert, and certainly ask your city or community leaders how you can help. You may find that they've been waiting for someone just like you to get in there and ask those questions and maybe be willing to roll up your sleeves and help. And again, find ways to empower yourself, your community, towards being more food secure and using urban agriculture to your advantage. So if you have any questions or thoughts, certainly feel free to send me an email. My name is Shauna Freeman. My email is sfreeman@highline.edu. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, and I hope the video that I've linked is one that sort of engages your interests as well. So thank you so much.
Wow, Shauna, thank you. That was really, really nice. And so that concludes our 5 days of sustainable agriculture. And what I really liked about what Shauna was saying was that what could be a possible next step. I like the idea of just, as she mentioned, starting with a simple herb container garden in your own windowsill. Simple as that. She referenced rosemary. It grows back when you trim it off to use it. It's just such a sustainable and easy to manage start, because sometimes like urban ag is like, oh, what about fertilizer? What about all this stuff, And it's like, it doesn't have to be complicated to start with. You can make it as complicated as you'd like to. And some people really enjoy getting that level of complexity going, but it doesn't have to start that way. And as she said, we have a sustainable agriculture program here at the campus that really enjoys helping people reach their goals and get started. If you're not sure where to go next, reach out to us. We have an Instagram account, and we also have a Facebook page. So I think that pretty much sums up a week of sustainable ag.